Hello, everyone. This is the second in the webinar series of Lab Girl presented by Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. In case you're not familiar with our gardens, first of all, I am Nanette Kick, Education Director. We are North America's highest botanic garden at 8,200 feet with a mission to deepen understanding and promote conservation of alpine plants and fragile mountain environments. And I'm going to give you a little introduction, share my screen with you. There we go. So I'd like to thank our sponsors for this presentation tonight. We are being sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts Big Read program. All of us in the Vail Valley are reading Lab Girl, so we're part of the One Book, One Valley Read. We are also thankful to the Town of Vail, the Town of Vail Library, and a local family foundation for sponsoring the evening speaker series at Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. We do have 2 more webinars in the series. Next month, on March 17th, we will have Dr. Chris Ray. Her topic of her talk will be Adventures in the Life of a Field Ecologist. And if any of you have joined us for any of the other garden webinars, Chris was definitely our top favorite. She is an expert on American picas, and she is a lot of fun to listen to and share her experience. And then on April 17th, Hope Jaron, the author of Lab Girl, will actually be joining us on with a virtual author event. So that should be kind of neat to meet Hope in person. This summer, the garden's annual theme is Plants Are an Answer. It's based on Drawdown's plant-based solutions. And in case you are not familiar with Drawdown, Drawdown is a nonprofit organization who has come up with 80 proposed solutions to get the planet's carbon emissions down to the point where we're actually drawing down emissions. And 11 of the 20 top 80 solutions presented by Drawdown are nature-based, and 23 out of the 80 are actually plant and food-based. So plants really are an answer to some of our difficult climatic change on the planet. All right, so I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, but I would also like to remind you that while you're listening to Emily's presentation, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice a Q&A box, and you can type in any questions that you have as Emily is speaking, and I will pass those questions on to her when she's finished her presentation. It's really my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Emily Griffoul. Emily started with the gardens in the summer of 2020 as a new conservation scientist. She has worked on ecological and conservation research all over the West, but fell in love with the unique beauty of alpine plants and the magic of Colorado, I think like we all have. Emily is leading the implementation of the North American Botanic Garden Strategy for Alpine Plant Conservation, a blueprint developed by the gardens to promote understanding and protection of vulnerable alpine species and habitats throughout ex-situ collections, surveys, and mapping of alpine areas and rare plants, collaborations with partners in other gardens and federal agencies, and public engagement. She received a master's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of California, Irvine, and previously worked for the Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois, where she worked to build a tree observatory with the Center for Tree Science. Emily is particularly interested in connecting and engaging with the public and invites everyone to come learn about conservation science and what we can do to protect alpine habitats. And I will also say that all of us at the gardens would love to have you visit. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Emily.
All right, thank you, Nanette. Let's see, I share my screen. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Nanette, for that kind introduction, and thank all of you for joining us here this evening. I'm really excited to talk about our conservation work at Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. But first off, I'm Emily. I would say that I'm more of a field girl than a lab girl, despite the name of our webinar series. And I've always loved the outdoors, but I think my career and interest in ecology really started with a really amazing professor during my undergrad at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. I had this professor, Dr. Judy Stone, who taught a woody plants course, which generally means trees, where we actually went out into the arboretum that was attached to our campus to look at trees and ID them. And you might not think that IDing trees in the middle of winter in Maine by their bark and their buds would be like a really great way to get interested in ecology. But for me, that was the start. And I've never looked back. And it's been just a really, really great journey since then. And I'm just really thrilled to be a part of the gardens. As Nanette said, I started last spring. And I just feel very incredibly lucky to join such a wonderful team and such an amazing ecosystem. So I think we'll dive on into my talk. Oops. So what is the Alpine anyway? You might think of the Swiss Alps or perhaps a glacier in Patagonia. And that is definitely true, but there's actually quite a few different Alpine ecosystems throughout the world. So on this map in purple, you can actually see a lot of the Alpine ecosystems spread out across all these different continents. We can see here in North America, coming right through the Rocky Mountains where we are, which kind of uniquely positions us to be one of the leaders in alpine ecology and alpine conservation because we are located within the Rocky Mountains and we're at 8,200 feet, which is the highest botanic gardens in North America. So we're actually able to grow many alpine species in our gardens, which is really, really exciting. So generally what the alpine means is above tree line, and this can vary across different areas. It's generally the general factors that influence whether trees can grow in an area are the temperature, the precipitation, the soil type, and the slopes of the terrain. But here in Colorado, our alpine starts at about 11,200 feet. It's inhabited by these cold adapted species that have evolved to handle some of the unique stressors of this environment. So plants include herbs, grasses, sedges, all of which have evolved to handle the really brutal environment and the really short growing season. And some of our animals include pikas and marmots, which again have also really evolved to handle this harsh environment. And what's interesting is that many of these plants that we find in the alpine, they actually can grow at much lower elevations and they can thrive at lower elevations. The issue is actually that at lower elevations, they're outcompeted by other species that are better adapted for those conditions. So they're outcompeted for space, for light, for water. So a lot of times they are kind of forced up into this harsh environment where no other plants want to grow. So that's kind of why we're finding these alpine plants in alpine areas, but we're also able to grow alpine species in our own gardens, even though we're only at 8,200 feet. So what does the alpine matter? What is the importance of the alpine? So although the alpine and the tundra only accounts for about 15% of the total land in the world, almost 50% of human populations depend on alpine areas for their fresh water. Furthermore, the alpine is home to many endemic plants and animals that you're not going to find in any other ecosystem. Endemic means native and restricted to a certain place. So you can imagine when we looked at that map of alpine areas, there's a lot of species that are only going to be found in those purple areas and nowhere else in the world. Some examples of the amazing plant and animal species in North America alpine areas include the pika, which I've included a picture of here. They might be kind of hard to see. It's in the middle of the picture, though. It's a small little fuzzy animal with round ears. They're in the rabbit family, and they generally live in scree and rocky slopes in the Alpine. They collect plants throughout the growing season, and they build these hay piles, and that'll feed them all winter long because they actually don't hibernate. And one of the common alpine plants is found in their hay piles. It's the alpine avens, or GM rossii. And this actually, in order to actually be digestible, it has to age for a bit. So it's a good thing that they collect it and store it in these hay piles for months before eating it. And as Nanette mentioned, our next speaker is Chris Ray. Dr. Chris Ray is a pica expert, and her talk is going to be really great. So if you're interested in hearing more about picas, definitely tune in for that. So what are the threats to the alpine? I would say there's two kind of categories of threats. One of them is through recreation. So things like ski resorts, snowmobiles, climbers, hikers. During the pandemic, if you were out in the alpine at all, if you were out hiking, you may have seen trails widening as everyone is standing on the side to avoid breathing on each other, which is great for reducing our coronavirus transmission, but not great for alpine species. So these are some images that I took while we were out in the field in alpine areas that were off a trail. You can really see that there's huge erosion happening. A lot of these plants are really, really stressed by being stepped on. Some of them have even been completely torn out of the soil, just lying in the middle of the trail. And that can be really, that's kind of the end of that plant. And some of these plants are really, really old despite being really, really small. So that's a big threat to alpine ecosystems. But the other biggest threat to alpine ecosystems is climate change. So the alpine is warming faster than other terrestrial areas, and this will lead to changes in plant composition, diversity, and distribution. And as I mentioned before, alpine plants don't necessarily live in alpine areas because they like it so much. They live there because they are adapted to these areas and they can outcompete other plants. But imagine as alpine areas warm up, these competitive lower elevation species are going to move into these newly warmed areas and start outcompeting our alpine species. And of course, our alpine species can start moving up the mountain into colder areas. But even here in Colorado, where we have extremely high mountains, most of them cap out at about less than 14,000 feet. So there's really very little room for alpine plants to migrate up into. So I think that's going to be like the biggest threat that we're seeing to alpine species. And alpine animals are also very vulnerable to climate change. Of course, I focus on plants because that's my area of interest and study, but alpine animals are also incredibly important. And for example, the pika, which I mentioned before, they can't survive in warm temperatures. So as these alpine areas get warmer, the pika are moving further and further up into the mountains. But again, at some point, they're going to run out of space to move into, and that's going to be really tragic for their populations. They also depend on snowpack in the winter. They don't hibernate, so they actually build these little burrows, and they're insulated by the snow. But if there isn't enough snowfall, they can actually get hypothermia and die because they don't have enough insulation from the snow. So they're also really vulnerable to these changing climate patterns. So climate change, of course, is a huge issue that we are definitely not going to tackle on our own. But if you're interested in learning more about how you can make a difference, as Annette said, we are starting, our summer exhibit is going to be on Project Drawdown. And it's going to be, I think, a really great way to figure out how we can make a difference in our personal lives. So definitely check that out. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the alpine is and why we need to conserve it, I'm going to get into how we're going to conserve it. So what are we going to do about protecting this alpine ecosystem? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're calling the Alpine strategy. And then I'm also going to talk about what our Betty Ford Alpine Gardens team has been up to this past summer in the alpine areas of Colorado. So the Alpine strategy is officially called the North American Botanic Garden Strategy for Alpine Conservation. And as Nanette mentioned, this is a blueprint for how botanic gardens can work together to conserve the alpine. And because we are at 8,200 feet, Betty Ford Alpine Gardens is uniquely positioned to be a leader in this field. We partnered with Denver Botanic Gardens to draft the strategy, and we're excited to work with other gardens and organizations to implement it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the strategy actually is comprised of. So we have 4 main objectives. The first is understanding and documenting plant diversity in the Alpine. So this is, we need to know what it is we're conserving before we, in order to conserve it. And then the second thing is ex-situ and in-situ conservation. So in-situ conservation means on-site conservation, and ex-situ conservation is off-site. So that essentially, are we taking things out of the environment to study them, or are we leaving them within the environment and surveying them or studying them within their habitat? The third objective is education and outreach. And this is, of course, so important to engage the public, to engage with people who are interested in this and educate people because this is, a really important topic. And Nanette is actually our education director. So this is kind of her whole field. And then our fourth objective is capacity building. And by that, we mean strengthening partnerships and educating the next generation of alpine ecologists and scientists and educators so that we can keep this going forever. I'm going to go through these a little bit more in depth. So for our first objective, understanding and documenting plant diversity. What does that mean? So we broke it down into several different targets, but we use a lot of different tools to actually achieve this objective. For one thing, we use what's called geographic information systems, or GIS, to build a digital dynamic map of all the alpine areas in North America by inputting different criteria such as species ranges, elevation, of course, precipitation patterns. And then the other thing is we're creating a comprehensive list of all of the alpine plant species in North America. And we're doing this by combing through historical records, plant keys, plant guides, field guides, talking to people to build this kind of dynamic database, not only of all the plants that are found in North America and where they're found, like generally, but also to make sure that we have all of the historic names of all of these plants. If you've done anything in botany, you probably know that over time, plant names change. Sometimes it's something really simple, like the epithet, like the species name might change. Sometimes it's a common name that might change. Sometimes they're reclassified into a new genus. So making sure that we have all of the historical names associated with that plant is really important, especially when we're going through historical documents. We want to match up what plants we're seeing. And so in this image, we actually have one of our interns this past summer, Tanaya, and she's out in the field at one of our field sites, and she's keying out different plants. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we key out plants, but that's generally what we're doing in the field there. For our second objective, the in situ and ex situ alpine plant conservation. Again, this is referring to plants, conserving plants within and outside of their habitats. So examples of in situ conservation include if we were mapping and documenting populations of rare plants, surveying important plant areas, making species lists, versus ex situ conservation includes collecting from the fields, so collecting herbarium specimens, seed from wild populations. And this is actually a big focus of our field activities. So I'll talk about this in more depth a little bit later. Our third objective, education and outreach, is one of the most important goals for the strategy. How are we going to engage the public with our conservation efforts? And so in these images, these are just 2 events that happened in the last year as part of our conservation education work. On the left, again, is our intern Tanaya. She set up a really fantastic a table in the gardens to talk to passersby about the conservation work that we're doing. And she actually has 2 herbarium specimens there to talk about, like, what are these? Why are we taking them? And on the right-hand side, we had an open house this past fall where we had an opportunity to talk to people about our seed cleaning and how we do that and why it's important. So we've been trying to engage with the public, and we're really excited to continue this kind of work. Our fourth objective is capacity building. And so, as I mentioned before, one of our biggest goals is strengthening partnerships and building new partnerships. Right now, we're working with the Center for Plant Conservation to work on some rare plant stuff. We send all of our seed to the National Laboratory for Genetic Resources Preservation, the USDA. It's in Fort Collins, and we're working with them pretty closely. We also are working with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, especially to identify some areas that we should revisit and document. And we're super excited to work with more botanic gardens and land managers going forward. And then the other side of capacity building is building up the next generation of conservation scientists, alpine ecologists, educators. And we're really excited that this year we got funding to have a conservation intern. So we feel like we're on our way to do that. So these images are from the field this past summer. We have some colleagues at Denver Botanic Gardens who are really phenomenal and came out in the field with us several times to do surveys and some seed collecting. And not only is it really fun to have other people out in the field, it's also really educational, and it's really great to hear about more of the natural history and the plants, and to get kind of that inside scoop on what these sites are like. And so in these images on the left, we have Amy Schneider, who's a horticulturist, and Mike Kinchin, who's a curator at Denver Botanic Gardens, who came out with us on this day to look for a rare plant. On the right-hand side, this was during a seed collecting expedition, and we had actually quite a big crew that day out to do some seed collecting, which was really just incredibly interesting and really fun. And we actually did find some rare plants that day as well, which is always very exciting. So next I'm going to talk about some of our field activities. And so this is going to be like the behind the scenes look at what is it like to be a field ecologist. Maybe you wonder what scientists say when they go into the field. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about what our team got up to the next summer, or this past summer. So being out in the field refers to any time our team goes into a natural area to make a collection or to look for a plant. Being in the field is one of my favorite parts of the job, especially in these stunning alpine environments. However, it can be pretty grueling as well. We've got steep, rugged terrain at altitude, often on scree or rocks. This image is actually a scree field. So you can imagine it's very unstable, really steep. Plus storms can come out of nowhere in Colorado. There have been several times when we've had to run down the mountain because an electrical storm started and came out of nowhere. And then last summer, we had a lot of smoke from the fires in Colorado. And this picture was actually taken just before, this was one of the interns last year, and just before she and I decided we needed to get out of the field because our throats were starting to really burn and get really itchy from all the smoke. So sometimes the field can be a little bit exciting, but most of the time it's incredibly fun and really interesting despite the challenges. So what do we actually do in the field? What do we do when we go out there? The first thing that we usually do is we want to try to make a floristic inventory, also known as a species list. We want to document every plant that we see out there. And this is important because throughout the season and throughout the year, we might see a lot of variability in what species are there. And we want to be able to refer back to notes about different locations and compare them. So how do we actually do that? One of the best tools that we use is called a dichotomous key. And we use that to identify species that aren't as readily identifiable. So a dichotomous key is a series of paired clues about a plant's traits. It's called a dichotomous key because it's a series of couplets. Essentially, is it these traits or these traits? And then you move on to the next clue. And each answer to each couplet leads you to even closer to the plant's true identity. We don't need to do this for every single plant that we see in the field. Some of them have very few or no similar plants. For example, the Alpine forget-me-not, which is the plant here on the left. That's Erythricium nanum. That's the only one that we have in Colorado. So there's really, once you see that, you know what species it is. Versus the right three photographs are of penstemons. And there's a lot of penstemons and they look very similar. So you really need to break out your key and use that to actually ID them down to species. So using a dichotomous key can be really tricky. There's a lot of information, a lot of morphological terms. It's essentially like learning another language. Even experienced botanists can get hung up on the terminology. For example, this summer, we had recurring confusion about what constituted a thyrse, which is a type of inflorescence, and it's used to ID penstemons. And we had to look it up so many times that it became kind of a running joke. And so I've actually highlighted that in the key up here in the top right-hand corner within the key for penstemons. And so these penstemons are all different species, even though they look similar. We've got Penstemon hallei, the penstemon, my favorite penstemon, Penstemon whippolanus, and Penstemon procerus on the right-hand side. So here in Colorado, we generally use Jennifer Ackerfield's Flora of Colorado. This is a really fantastic dichotomous key. So we bring that with us everywhere as kind of our field Bible. We also bring other guides with us. Sometimes we'll bring a guide that has really great photographs, or that might be a little bit more simple, or we have one that is like specifically for the Alpine. And if the area was previously surveyed, we'll also bring out whatever records we can find. We use a website called SignNet that is a database of all of the herbarium specimens that have ever been collected. And you can input a specific area. And then you can pull out like a record of what's been found in these areas before, what's been verified before. It kind of gives you a baseline to work from. And so then these are some images of our team in the field, keying out plants. So if you ever see a botanist just hanging out, looking at plants like this, that's what they're doing. Oh, and one more thing about that. The other thing that we're doing when we're looking at these populations and making these species lists is we're also taking note of any populations of plants that could support a seed collection. This is one of our goals for the Alpine strategy in order to conserve Alpine plants. And I'll talk about this in more depth a little bit later. But we want to find these populations that could support a seed collection without impacting their own fertility. So we want it to be big enough that we can collect about 3,000 seeds and have that still be less than 10% of the seeds that's going to be produced in that population. And so we'll return to these populations throughout the season to check up on them and make sure their seed is developing properly. Plus, a lot of plants look completely different when they're ready for seed collection versus when they were flowering. So it's important to make sure we keep an eye on them and know who's who. And then sometimes when we identify a population that we think would be a great seed collection, it doesn't pan out. Like last year we had a big drought. So many of the populations we thought we would collect from ended up aborting their seeds. So, it's always important to go back out and make sure that they're actually developing properly. So one of the other main things that we did in the field is surveying important plant areas. And so these are areas that have high biological diversity or rare plants. We're working with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program to visit sites that they've identified to being home to rare plants. But some of these sites haven't been visited in years, sometimes in decades. So it's really exciting to go back out to these sites and check them out and see, do they still deserve the important plant area designation? A lot of times when we're looking for a rare plant, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. They're very, very small. Most Alpine plants are extremely small. And often we don't have the precise location. For example, on the left in this slide is an image of Erigeron humilis, the Arctic alpine daisy, which is an uncommon species. We went out to look for it in the mosquito range, and we spent almost a whole day looking and didn't find it. And we were getting a little bit disappointed. And then only to have our intern find it when she was literally looking at another plant. So it was like right there, just tucked in among the rocks. In the middle is Ipomopsis globularis, or the Hoosier Pass Ipomopsis. And this is an endemic species to Colorado. It's really lovely. It smells amazing. And it's one of those it's a really fun, cute little plant. And then on the far right, we have Papaver radicatum subspecies cluanense. It's the alpine poppy. It's a rare and it's truly stunning. And again, one of those rare plants that when you find it, it's just like it's very exciting. And so one of the other things that we do out in the field is ex-situ conservation. So up until now, I've been describing what's called in-situ conservation, so on-site conservation, mapping, surveying, making species lists. This is all examples of in-situ conservation. But one of our main goals for the Alpine strategy is to actually do a lot of seed collecting and preserve those seeds in case anything happens to wild populations. And so part of that is also getting an herbarium specimen for each of the collections. So not only are herbarium specimens needed for seed collections, they're also a really important way that we document the plants that we see in the field. They're called voucher specimens because they vouch for the identity of the plants that are out there. So we dig up the entire plant and we press it in a plant press until it's dry. And then we mount it and label it. And that's when it goes to an herbarium. And an herbarium is essentially like a plant record library. We use the Catherine Kalmbach herbarium at Denver Botanic Gardens. It's a really world-class herbarium. So we're really excited to send our specimens there. And these records are just incredible and they can last a really long time. Many of the plants that were collected by the original Colorado explorers, they were found and sent back and identified and preserved and are actually still available as herbarium records for comparison to other plants. So that's very cool. You do need a permit to collect these, so keep that in mind if you're excited about them. And then this year we actually collected 71 voucher specimens, which was really great. And so these are images of our interns in the field digging up and pressing some of our herbarium vouchers. The other big ex-situ conservation activity that we're doing in the field is seed collecting. So this is a really important way to conserve any kind of plant. And as I said, throughout the season, we go back and revisit populations of alpine species that could support a seed collection. Again, we want to take less than 10% of the total seeds in the population to make sure that they won't be affected. And then we don't return to collect from that population for many years to make sure that it recovers. You need a permit from a land manager in order to collect seed. And part of that permitting process is also that you need to get an herbarium voucher specimen to prove essentially that the species that you're collected seed from is the one that you say it is. So seed collecting is a big job, even though the seeds are very, very tiny. So it's a whole team on deck kind of activity. We were very lucky this summer. I think every staff member at Betty Ford Alpine Gardens came out at least once to help with our seed collecting. And we collected 64 collections this year, despite the fact that it was a drought and there were several populations that we ended up not being able to collect from. So the next step is seed cleaning. So as I said, the seeds are very, very small. On the right-hand side is actually my hand with moss campion seeds, Silenia caulis. They are smaller than sesame seeds. So you can imagine that cleaning these seeds is time consuming and can be very tedious. You need to be very patient. So to clean seeds, we remove the chaff and anything that's not the seed. So any petals or rocks or leaves that made it in there. And we were also extremely lucky to have some really dedicated and patient volunteers help us with this seed cleaning this year. So we're hoping to continue that next year. And then what happens to the seed? So once it's cleaned, where does it go? What happens to it? So we collect seed for again, ex-situ conservation. So some of the seeds that we collect are going to be banked long-term at the National Lab for Genetic Resources Preservation at the USDA in Fort Collins. So these will serve as essentially a black box storage in case anything happens to the wild populations. And one of our partners over at the USDA, Dr. Chris Walters, takes them out every couple of years to test their viability, to make sure that they're actually, that if we did need to take them out of storage, that we'd actually be able to produce plants from them. We actually don't know very much about how alpine species do in seed banking. So this is really valuable information. As you can imagine, most of the species, the plant species that have been banked up until now have a lot of economic value. So we just don't really know that much about alpine species. Other seeds we'll plant in our gardens, and then we'll maintain those as living collections of these plants. Again, just in case the seed banking doesn't work out, it's always nice to have some backup. But regardless of where the seed is headed, whether it's headed to the seed bank or it's headed to our gardens, it's good to know how viable the seed is to start with before we do anything with it. So Alex Seglith down at Denver Botanic Gardens helped us run some viability trials this fall on the seed that we collected this year. And so these images are of the moss campion again, the Silene caulis. And you can see in the left-hand side that 100% of the seeds that we trialed actually germinated, which is very exciting and kind of unusual. And on the right-hand side is just a close-up picture of the little sprouts. And we'll keep growing these little sprouts in the solution until they're big enough to be transported or transplanted to our cold frames. Our cold frames protect them from really severe extreme cold. So they're a little bit more coddled in there until they're big enough and strong enough that we can actually plant them in the gardens. So these specific individuals probably won't be big enough to plant in the gardens for a couple of years. But we're excited for them when they are. And so what's next for our gardens? And what's next for our conservation program? We're going to continue our ex-situ conservation efforts, so including collecting seeds from alpine species, including documenting all the alpine plants that we're finding. We're also going to continue to nurture our collaborations with other gardens and organizations. And we're really hoping, COVID permitting, that we'll be able to visit some potential partners soon. And if you're interested, if you're gardens or a land manager and you are interested in participating with us on the Alpine strategy, like we would be thrilled. So definitely let me know. We'll visit more important plant areas, and we're going to do some documenting and mapping of rare plants in Colorado. We're working on setting up our own seed bank and doing some viability trials. And then the final thing that we're excited to add to our program this year is citizen science. So citizen science is an opportunity to get involved in science, even if you aren't a formally trained scientist. So this will help engage the public, but also provide us with really meaningful data. So even if you don't live in the Central Rocky Mountains, these projects that I'm going to talk about are actually available in other areas as well. So we're planning to get these projects kind of up and running by the spring, and we'd love your participation if you're interested in being a citizen scientist. So the first one is Project Budburst. So this is an organization that was started at the Chicago Botanic Gardens, and it documents phenology throughout many different species over the entire country. Phenology is the study of the timing of seasonal events, such as budburst or leafing out, and anyone can participate. And we're really excited to add observations of alpine plants to this project. The second project that the second citizen science project that we're excited about is the EcoFlora project. This uses the iNaturalist app to document species observations. It's very easy to use if you've used the iNaturalist app. It's super easy. You just snap a pic, you're on a hike, you're like, oh, that's a cool plant. You can snap a pic, and then this information will be really helpful to us to understand more about where we're finding different species in the alpine areas of North America, and especially Colorado. So if you're interested in phenology or in iNaturalist and want to get involved, like keep an eye out for that. We'd love your participation. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to our team, the Betty Ford Alpine Garden staff. Of course, as I said, every single member of our staff came out this season to help with seed collection. We also had some amazing collaborators over at Denver Botanic Gardens, specifically Jennifer Ramp Neal, who who was a very important part of the Alpine strategy. Mike Kinchin and Amy Schneider, Alex Seglius. We have some amazing volunteers that I'd like to thank. And And I'd finally like to acknowledge that this conservation program and the Alpine strategy have been in the works for several years, but it has been with the partnership of a very generous local family that we've actually been able to make this work possible. And thank you to all of you for listening. And let me know if you have any questions.
Hey there, Emily. I'm going to pass on a few questions that we've had while you've been talking. First of all, the website for the database that we for all the plants, I think we call it SciNet, and I saw that one of our Q&A people actually put the website address in there. It seems to have disappeared on my screen, but hopefully it's there for everybody else. But just in case you don't know how to spell SciNet, it's SEINET. And if you just get in touch with us at our Betty Ford Alpine Gardens website, we can always pass that information on to you. One person was asking if we use a GPS to go back to our locations.
We do. Yes, we actually GPS the location of every herbarium voucher that we take from the field, as well as every seed collection and every rare plant. So we're going to use this information as part of our mapping and understanding the alpine areas of North America. Right now, we have a pretty basic map with just a few little points on there of the different populations that we've surveyed so far. But that is definitely something that we're excited about, expanding our GIS program.
Okay, and then another question about technology. Do we use drones, and do we have trouble with technology out in our remote areas?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a really, really great question. We're not doing that right now. I guess we're kind of in the starting stages of our conservation program here at Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. But I think that some of these ideas for remote sensing would be interesting to pursue. I don't know about the drone work as much as I personally have found drones to be very useful for research. We'd have to think about the impact of drones on the alpine areas because they are so incredibly sensitive. But on the other hand, the classic ecology conundrum of by studying something, you're also damaging it or influencing it. So these remote sensing opportunities would, I think, be a really interesting avenue to pursue.
And then do we start most of our seeds in the agar type solution?
Great question. That's how we started our viability trials this year. In some ways, we are thinking right now that might be a little bit overkill in terms of the kind of information that we're looking for, because we're really just looking for what percentage of these seeds is viable today, so that when we look at these seeds a year from now, 5 years from now, we can compare this baseline viability to whatever the viability is then. That being said, we are in the process of kind of exploring what kind of capabilities for viability trials we could set up at our gardens. And it all comes down to what kind of space and how much cost it's going to be. I'd love to be able to do this for every population that we collect, which means that they'd have to be pretty simple and efficient, time efficient and cost efficient in order to make them actually feasible.
Yeah, and so Kath asks, do we plan to return our seedlings to the field? How would you go about it? And how would you decide where to put them?
Great question. So right now we're not going to return our seedlings to the field. The Silene acaulis, the moss campion that I showed a picture of, we're going to plant those in our gardens. So they'll be like a living collection with this document of where they came from in case we ever need to know. That being said, the seeds that are in the seed bank, there's a possibility that if a population of a plant was wiped out because of a natural disaster or a human caused disaster or something happened to a wild population, and the Forest Service or the BLM or whoever the land manager is wanted to do a restoration, we might be able to provide some of the seeds for that restoration. But we wouldn't do that ourselves. We'd work with the land manager.
And we also have a question on our citizen science projects and where do we use the data for the citizen science projects and how do we use the data?
So we are just starting to get into this arena of citizen science, but my hope is that we're going to use this data to kind of build up even more of our knowledge of alpine areas in North America. As I said, we're building maps of alpine areas. Knowing what species are in each of these alpine areas would be incredibly helpful information. Plus the phenology data, the bud burst data, I think ideally that would just be amazing information to have, especially when we're so focused on the threat that climate change is affecting on alpine ecosystems. So knowing what the year-to-year variability between different populations in different areas, but even within the same population and how it's changing over time is going to be just incredibly important information going forward.
And then we had a couple of comments to make sure that people understand that we would never consider using drones in the wilderness area because they're not
Definitely.
allowed. So,
Yeah.
so we are quite aware of that fact, and we certainly respect the quiet and solitude of the wilderness areas. And let me see, we have a question about advice for young girls who might be interested in learning more about field conservation. Do you have any good books, documentaries, anything to recommend?
Oh, that is such a great question.
Of course, there's Lab Girl, right?
Right. There is Lab Girl, which I think is a really interesting book. I would say getting started, if you're interested in ecology, I would get started with the iNaturalist app. Especially it can open the door to so much information, and you don't even necessarily need to be a botanist to use it. So you can start getting observations like tomorrow if you download the app, and I think it's free. So that's how I would get started. I might also get like one of the field guides. I probably wouldn't get the Flora of Colorado because it's a bit dense, even though it's very, very useful. But I would start maybe with a field guide that had some great photographs, so that you could go out and start making your own field lists and your own floristic inventories and get started that way.
Yeah, I definitely concur that it's good to start off with pictures. Even when we key it out with the flora, having a picture to verify your choice is always good.
Yeah, it definitely is. And sometimes it will help narrow down to, you know, it's between these 3 species, not between these 20 species, which is really helpful. But then also I would, going back to that question, I would keep an eye out for any kind of opportunities, even extracurricular opportunities to do science, like hands-on science. And I'm not sure if there's, I'm not sure what there is in the Vail Valley, but I think that would be really exciting to do.
Yeah, and then Kath also gave us shameless plug for the Great Courses course on the Introduction to Botany, which is a really very interesting place to start if you don't have a botany background. I agree with that.
Yeah, definitely.
And we have a question of, do we have any current restoration projects underway?
We do not. Yeah, we're a very small gardens. So right now we're not doing any restoration projects, partly because that wouldn't really be in our jurisdiction. We'd want to work with the land managers. If they want to do a restoration, we might be able to contribute to that project, but not right. We're not doing that right now.
And Nick, our curator of plant collections, also wanted to add that we do take a small percentage of the seed, grow them in cold frames outside to mimic similar conditions in the field, and then we grow them in our own garden. Betty Ford Alpine Gardens, if you have not been there, is a fantastic showcase of alpine plants from all over the world, including some of our natives. And Betty Ford Alpine Gardens has the APGA recognized collection of Colorado alpines. So we are nationally recognized for that. So if you haven't come, if you really want to see the coolest collection of alpines, you definitely have to come to Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. And someone else recommended if you're out there in the field using the Alpine Flower Finder, that little
Definitely.
tiny book that we use. It's a really great tiny little key for when you really know you're in the Alpine and you want to find those plants. Yes, we use that one all the time.
Yeah, and you can get that one through the Colorado Native Plant Society store. So definitely
Right,
a great key to have.
right. And for other books that they're really good and it helps support their organization. So if you're going to buy some plant books, they're a great place to buy them from.
Yeah, definitely.
And then we have volunteer already for our citizen science project, so we'll be really
Yay!
happy for that.
Okay, fantastic.
And somebody mentioned National Geographic BioBlitzes too. Yeah, we there are BioBlitzes that go on in Colorado, and we should definitely advertise those on our website whenever we find out about them. So people that
Yeah,
want to participate would be great.
I'm curious to know what's going to happen this year with COVID. It'd be great to like actually be
Right.
able to go out with other people.
Let's see. Yes, we have somebody mentioned the Colorado 14ers initiative and how they're doing alpine restoration. Yes, and we are working in collaboration with Colorado 14ers initiative. In fact, we had their CEO give a presentation last summer. So we definitely appreciate all the work that they're doing. We're up there just doing all we can to identify the plants, but we definitely need all the help we can to correct all the damage that's been done, especially since 14ers have become such a popular thing to do, bagging all the 14ers. Let's see what else we have. Okay, so we've been asked if we have school kids come and introduce them, and of course, Tom, we do what we can. We're a pretty small organization, but we are always open to have any school group come and visit us in the gardens, and also if any schools want to reach out to us, we'd be happy to work with them. But right now with COVID, it's sort of limited us a little bit, but we can all see the light at the end of the tunnel for that. And let's see, Amy Schneider from Denver Botanic Gardens says there's a great book by Barbara Gears about the history of herbarium collections. Oh yeah, I think I just got that book for you, Emily. It's on your desk. Yeah, I think it is a great book, Amy. Thank you. We both looked through it. It's pretty good. And Kath has also supplied the Conip's bookstore website if any of you are interested in ordering any of those books. So you can get that in the Q&A column. We've got been asked if we participate in the Gloria project.
So right now we are not participating in any Gloria projects. We might be interested in doing that in the future. Right now, our team is very small. This coming season is just going to be me and an intern, and then occasionally help from the rest of our staff. But so that would be a lot for just the two of us to monitor a Gloria plot. But we would be interested in kind of pursuing that idea in the future and figuring out if there was a way that we could get involved.
Yeah, so our executive director has also wants us to do a shameless plug. If any of you are local and can vote in with the Vail Valley Partnership to consider Betty Ford Alpine Gardens as the best place to work next year. So please, if any of you do their survey, we would love a little shameless plug there. So it looks like that's the last of our questions. Let me just check the chat box here. I think it's just more kudos, and we really appreciate everything that you do for us, Emily, and we're really excited to be pulling the Alpine strategy forward with your help. So thanks a lot, and thank you, all of you, for listening to our talk and being a part of our garden community.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Nanette.
You're welcome. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.